After the Masquerade, the masks come off, using the Unmasking Diary to explore the everyday process of neurodivergent autistic unmasking. Author Natasha Stavros, PhD, speaks with licensed marriage and family therapist Sarah Liebman, diagnosed ADHD with special interest all things neurodiverse. Join us in this episode of Following the Threads as we explore social, psychological, and spiritual frameworks that empower resilience through change. As a reminder, this podcast is for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute counseling, psychotherapy, or mental health services. Listening to this podcast or communicating with the host and guests does not form a therapist-client relationship. The information here is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your own mental health professional with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Welcome to Following the Threads. I'm Natasha Stavros.
And I'm Sarah Liebman.
Today's episode will be about neurodivergent burnout and skill regression. And also, we're back.
We're back.
So I am currently on long-term disability. I originally took family medical leave to take care of complex PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder flare-up after I disclosed to my place of employment about my diagnosis and a need for accommodations. And we will certainly have episodes around that. But for today, I wanted to talk about something common that happens to people, including myself currently, after they find out about a diagnosis. And that is neurodivergent burnout and skill regression. So importantly, this actually can happen at any time, not just after you get a diagnosis. It just so happens that it is common after a diagnosis.
Right, because it kind of frames what may have happened many times before in the context of autism.
Right. And so following our story in season 1 and thinking that you might need an assessment to actually getting an assessment and a diagnosis, this episode explores what autistic burnout is, how you recover, and what is the antidote to a more resilient life.
Mm-hmm.
So before we start, though, let's talk a little bit about autistic burnout. It could be confused with depression, and it could also be confused with non-autistic burnout. So Can you help us to unpack? First, let's just talk about what is depression. Like, how do I know I'm not in a depressed state right now? Like, what makes this different?
Well, I think what makes it different is that instead of it just being like a loss of pleasure in doing things or not having very much energy, it is like your ability to speak will decrease for a lot of people. Kind of like, I can't think, not just I don't want to think about, I can't think. They talk about it as a burnout. There's skill regression. And in depression, there can be kind of a diminishing of, energy and ability to handle things. But it doesn't sort of take you all the way back to a place where you just don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And it kind of strips you down from a person who seems to be living in the world to a person who's like, how did I ever do that? Right. And
I think one of the things
overlap.
And I think one of the things you mentioned to me that was really sort of crystal clear when we were talking about it was that interventions for depression are activation based.
Yeah.
Whereas in burnout, and whether it's autistic or not autistic, it's less about activation because actually activation increases the load and further exacerbates the symptoms.
Yes.
So it's almost, if you can't really tell, it's almost like Well, if you try depression interventions and you're noticing it having the opposite effect, that's probably not just depression.
Yeah. And, I remember hearing someone say recently, like, if you have a patient who has treatment-resistant depression, consider an autism evaluation because, antidepressants work to some degree. Activation strategies work to some degree, but they don't touch the core of, I can't try to return to my prior functioning because that was already something that was a load that was unsustainable, right? And so people who live with this kind of chronic untreatable depression, one of the questions is like, well, is that depression? Or is that chronic burnout that sometimes dips deep?
So that's sort of the difference between depression and burnout. But within burnout, there's autistic burnout and there's non-autistic burnout.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the difference between those two?
Well, again, it's sort of like with depression that is not autistic burnout, the strategies are more likely to be effective and affect more of a long-term change. So with occupational burnout, again, we probably know less about the overlap between autistic or ADHD burnout and occupational burnout, but they've been working a long time to be able to measure this. There are, say, nurses, there's like it's called the Copenhagen Burnout Scale, which is often used to measure burnout in healthcare settings. And in that, what's often recognized is burnout is usually like, I don't really care about my job. I don't have any motivation to keep seeing what the future holds. And it can be, greatly influenced by what the institutional setup is. So a department that was, kind of had reasonable functioning gets a new manager, and then, there's something about the way that manager generally impedes on autonomy and agency, and people start to get burnout in the department. In the case of like a healthcare provider or a mental health provider, it's kind of being presented over and over with the same level of distress or trauma or what it might be, and there's kind of no escape from it, right? But the fundamental difference is that if you have occupational burnout and you are able to, either within the organization or by leaving the organization, recapture autonomy and agency as an employee or a contributor, then the burnout often lifts and shifts. Now, what we're going to talk about a little more is, the autistic burnout and how is that treated differently. But, burnout as we know it best in the research around occupational burnout is the renegotiation of who I am and what I do and what my purpose is in my workplace is often there.
And I think the words that you used for me when we were talking about this is that with non-autistic or occupational burnout, it's possible to resume after a period of rest because the self existed before.
Yeah.
Whereas with autistic burnout, your entire sense of self is no longer what it was. And this is actually developmental, which is partly where the skill regression comes from.
Right.
And that's sort of part of the distinction.
Right. And, with that, I want to say, we could be fussy about what the word sense of self means, but the way that I think about it is parts of the self developed or not, right? And so when there's and you have a autism diagnosis that has like social communication domain, the person has created a lot of ways to get by, masking, camouflaging, withdrawing to hide burnout, but they haven't built something based on who they really are and what they really need.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's why it's going to be really interesting to see what it's like for, the generations coming up getting diagnosed earlier and actually getting accommodations so that they can build those parts of themselves in closer to the developmental timeline.
Yeah. And that's such a really good lead in to the second point that we wanted to talk about, which is how do you begin to recognize it? Because you brought up even sort of seeing yourself.
Yeah.
Right. I think a big thing for me is like, I don't even know who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything, I feel like so much of everything I've ever done has been because I knew it was expected of me, so I did it. And I never allowed myself to see or recognize myself or what I wanted because what I wanted didn't matter.
Yeah.
Because it was more important for me to conform. It was more important for me to fit in the way that I was supposed to fit in than for me to even acknowledge my wants or desires in that space. And so the second thing that we wanted to talk about is how do you recognize it? And with my therapist, I've been talking about kind of understanding my window of tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I talked about this as sort of like containers.
Yeah.
Right? Is that your window of tolerance is a smaller container inside the bigger container that is life that you live within.
Yeah.
And part of where I am right now is I have no idea who I am until I'm like pushing or overflowing past my window of tolerance. And so what's happening is really extreme meltdowns and shutdowns, which we'll have a whole series on what those are. But it's that I'm on that edge and I'm just even trying to discover, am I being pushed over the edge because of something internal happening within me?
Right.
Or is it external to me? Like, I don't even know any of this. Like, all of it is new.
All you know is you find yourself in a moment and you're like, okay, now I know that's not what I used to think it was. Okay. Like sometimes it's just that much.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what you said about I don't even know who I am is so important because I think one of the things that, we're always trying to help people understand is like, I know I used to say that to people all the time. So I'm like, I need to go and like find out who I really am. And I remember many people be like, what do you mean? Like you've been you the whole time. And I'm like, oh, really? That's how you feel? But like, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this, or I don't know how I would react if I knew myself, right? Like I didn't know what knowing myself would look like, but I had the sense that like it was offset in a way for me that other people weren't experiencing. I know. And was thinking about what you just said about I didn't know what were my wants or my desires. I think it's even more sort of down deep inside that doesn't even have words.
Like
it's
primal.
like I didn't primal, primitive, right? Is my body sending me a signal? Is that what this is?
Am I supposed to be listening
what
to
do
that
I do
right
with
now?
this,
Yeah.
right? And if I listen to this, what's going to happen? Because I can't do this every time X happens because I'll be exhausted or, so, a lot of times, you're finding yourself kind of like washing up on a beach and like, how did I get here? How do I get here?
So it's like the movie The Hangover.
Yes.
You're trying to like, okay, so let's recreate the last 39 years of my life.
Exactly. You're backwards mapping it, right? And that's, it's it's a long kind of weird being in reverse.
So if you recognize it within yourself, and it is, and depression interventions don't work, and non-autistic or occupational interventions like rest
Yeah, or just changing jobs.
Yeah.
Or, you know.
Yeah, and rest and sleep aren't really enough. And I will say that, you know, for me with autistic burnout, rest isn't enough. I am sleeping quite well right now, but I am exhausted 24/7. I mean, even when I talk with you guys in preparing for this podcast, you're like, you need to add some energy to your voice.
Well, I didn't say add your energy. You were just talking really softly, and I was like, that sounds like burnout, like level. Like you're tired, you're devitalized in a way.
But I think, so for me, I think a really good reason why sleep and rest is not enough is because autistic burnout is being like an overloaded circuit board. And you turn it off for days, weeks, or even months, and then turning it on again, expecting it not to overload when clearly there is too much signal powering through at any given time. And so actually you need a different circuit board.
Right.
Or
it's
you need to adjust that power.
Rewiring, I think.
Yeah. And so rest is really just a Band-Aid on a gushing wound, and it's not really a long-term solution. And in my experience, at least over the last 5 years, is returning to the status quo, like a full-time job, you know, being the breadwinner for my family, doing all the things, without actually changing the underlying environmental mismatch actually leads to repeat incidents.
Yeah.
And I can't, it's like I'm a hamster in a wheel and I can't get off the wheel.
Yeah.
And I can't stop the train from happening. And when I was talking with my therapist about this, you know, one of the things we talked about was, well, you know, you're overloaded. Mm-hmm. So we need to take some of the load off. Well, how can you take some of the load off? And, you know, I said, well, I could talk to my friends. I could talk to my husband. I could talk to my daughter and, you know, see if they can help me. And she recognized that I was very uncomfortable doing that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not kind of astute. That's extremely astute. And that many high masking adults with a late diagnosis actually survived through hyperindependence. Yeah. And so how do you actually shift your thinking so that you can actually begin to even ask for help?
And what is asking for help?
Yeah. And I think you had talked about sort of this idea of switching from delegation to attunement and tracking. So, and I was like, oh my gosh, all these big psychotherapy words. Can you unpack that for me?
Yeah. So, a lot of times what happens when one finds themselves overloaded is like, oh, well, maybe your husband could pick up the slack. Maybe you could get a cleaning person, or maybe you could take a nap on the weekend, or, you know, something like that. And so it's kind of saying like, why don't you offload for a little while and then you'll take it back. You'll take it all back on. Right. But it doesn't address that the reason you're overloaded is because there have been decisions made for reasons that nobody ever thought of, and that maybe life just can't be the way it ever was, because that was always based on, you know, these
well, and even delegating is load.
Delegating is a huge load. I mean,
like I have to think about all the things that I need.
Say it's easier for me to do. I'd rather be exhausted and do it myself, right, than delegate. And so what is attunement and what is tracking? And so, you know, it's a lot of what we do when we have an infant is we start to we notice the small signs. We start to create, you know, little patterns, right? But we start to do it for ourselves. So we tune in. And
which is something that we started to do before we got the diagnosis.
Yes. And that was part of what takes one to the place of like, I'm tuning in and I'm seeing this really differently, right? That part of that self-study.
Right.
You know, and that shifting from delegation to attunement and tracking. So you're tuning in and you're tracking and you're making the connections to actually, if I have to be the one who handles bedtime all by myself, I can't do it. It's the end of the day. All of my sensory battery has been used up. This is what I can do, and this is the part that needs to change.
Yeah. So a real cornerstone of recovery is this extremely long process.
Yeah.
Of renegotiating how you exist in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for today, we talked about autistic burnout, how it differs from non-autistic burnout and depression. We talked about how there is research out there that tries to categorize levels of burnout. There's an adaptation of the Copenhagen burnout scale that's being worked for autistic people, and we have that linked below. And then we also talked a little bit about the idea of actually recovery is this renegotiation process. And so with that, I just want to say, subscribe to the podcast to hear next week's episode on reflection without projection. What happens when you receive a late neurodivergent diagnosis as a parent? We will actually have our first ever guest.
And we're so excited. We love this person and we love her work.
Yes. And so please like, share, or comment. We look forward to getting to know you.
All right. See you next time.
This episode of Following the Threads is inspired by The Unmasking Diary, snippets from the book After the Masquerade, a memoir by Natasha Stavros. The Unmasking Autism Diary. Autism, ADHD, or ADHD burnout, and skill regression. I am beyond tired. I do not remember being this tired in my entire life, except for when I was in my 3rd trimester, maintaining an extra organ and an entire human being while working full-time with insomnia. I am not depressed. Unlike other times in my life when I have fantasized about a world without me, that the burden of my existence for myself and others would be casually alleviated if I could just fall in front of a bus on my bike and die. It's not suicide if it's an accident. I do not feel this now. I do not wish for an end to my existence. Just that I can no longer operate in the world as I once did. I am sleeping 9 hours a night, uninterrupted, with deep sleep and REM. I wake up. I do the morning chores. I feed and walk our pets and get our daughter to school. Then I come home, and all I want to do is melt into the couch. Watching TV tires me. I watch, and by the end of the episode, I have no idea what I just watched. Listening to audiobooks tires me. I have started the same chapter every night for the last 7 days. I can't tell you who the main characters are. Thinking about feeding myself tires me. I don't even like the idea of most food, even my favorites, let alone the idea that I have to prepare anything. It is honestly just easier to not eat unless someone puts food down in front of me. I look at my phone. I see the calendar. 2 30-minute meetings, and the weight of exhaustion sits on my chest. After, I had to lay on my bed with blackout curtains drawn, and only my dog lay on my chest, reducing all sensory input. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep. I had to drive 15 minutes on the freeway, and anxiety filled my body. I moved to the slowest lane. I hate having to leave my 5-mile loop around town or drive faster than 40 miles per hour. I cannot keep track of time. My calendar and organization of time was a super skill I had developed to manage my poor working memory and poor time management. If everything was in the calendar with notifications, then I didn't have to remember something or drop the ball. Now, time escapes me. I can keep time to make it to, at most, 4 or 5 activities in a day. My morning walk with the dogs, my daughter to school, picking up my daughter from school, getting into bed, and maybe one more thing. Those are the only times I can seem to keep in my mind. I look at the calendar, then the clock, then back at the calendar, an empty memory of when I am supposed to do anything. In my relationships, I am not engaging in conversation. It is easier to listen than to participate. I can talk to the clerk in passing, but only because it is empty. I cannot find the words to express what is inside of me, nor do I know how to even begin to share it with another person. All of this is, of course, exacerbated by the fact that I am not only autistic, but I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, which has led me to be hyper-independent. I've learned to survive by not relying on anyone else to care for my needs, because until recently, my reality wasn't acknowledged. I've been reading about autistic burnout and skill regression. I do identify with autistic burnout. I am now 8 weeks into my 12-week leave from work. The idea of going back seems an impossibility. I do not, however, identify with the word skill regression. In particular, it's not that I do not cognitively understand how to do something. For example, to eat food, you first make a choice on what to eat, prepare it, put it in your mouth, chew, and swallow. I cognitively understand how to do all this. It's just that I can't actually get myself to eat on my own. I stand there, staring at the fridge. There are too many choices and too much work between making the choice and actually eating. I know what I'm supposed to do. I just can't seem to act. And that feels like a regression in my ability to cope with demand and load, not in the ability to do the thing. This text is a snippet from my next book, After the Masquerade. For early access to the book and other resources, upgrade to a paid subscription via Substack at natashastavros.substack.com. Thanks for joining us today on this episode of Following the Threads. I'm Natasha Stavros, co-host and executive producer, here with Sarah Liebman, co-host, Linda Highfield, director, and Noah Smith, audio engineer and composer.